on Interdisciplinary Cyber Physical Systems by DST, Department of Science and Technology, Government of India in March 2020. A Section 8 company, IHF Foundation for Cobotics, IHFC, was incorporated on June 13, 2020. About IHFC. Advances in sensing, computation, and autonomy are enabling robots and autonomous systems to enter real-world domains such as manufacturing, defense, medical, agriculture, etc., where machines must work alongside and interact with humans. We are entering an era of manned and unmanned teaming where humans and robotic systems must work together towards common goals. The four verticals of IHS: medical, agriculture, industry, and defense are goals. Human robot collaboration for enhancing human capabilities and reducing risk and improving productivity. Our objectives: research on novel technology areas of robotics and automation science, development of products for benefit of society, inculcation of startups, and promoting entrepreneurship in India. Our CQ: concept, collaborate, commercialize. From research to product. Grand projects of IHFC: medical simulator, human robot interaction control, rehabilitation robotics, drone applications, healthcare robotics, human robot interaction intelligence, intelligent sensing and secure communication, and Industry 4.0. Bird, a center of excellence at IIT Delhi. About Bird, biologically inspired robots and drones. The Center of Excellence on Bird, biologically inspired robots and drones at IIT Delhi is an evolution from its humble research activities, which began a few decades ago by its faculty drawn from the Department of Mechanical, Electrical, and Computer Science Engineering. Bird has 10 plus projects, industrial and academic, 27 plus members, including faculty, students, and technical staff across various departments of IIT Delhi, 150 plus publications in international and national conference and journals, 9 years of experience. Cognitive Science Program, a Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Delhi. Cognitive Science Group at IIT Delhi is to create a knowledge pool that can address relevant problems under the ambit of human cognition both for India and the world at large. It helps students acquire a strong background in theoretical frameworks and empirical approaches of one or more areas of cognitive science. Cognitive science is an emerging new field of study that endeavors to study the mind from multiple perspectives and disciplines by combining ideas, principles, and methods from psychology, linguistics, philosophy, computer science, and neuroscience. This knowledge is applied for developing a better understanding of how our minds, brains work while creating better products, tools, services, and policies. CoboTalks, leading the way in the human-robot collaboration space. IHFC.
So welcome everyone to our 10th CoboTalks. Today we have Professor David Hananel from University of Washington as our guest speaker. So before we start with our talk, three important announcements. So IHFC has launched a global online course on fundamental of cobotics and allied areas. So whoever wants to register can visit the link provided. Next, we have the entrepreneurship and research development program to for the budding young researchers and entrepreneurs. Please visit ihfc.co.in/activities for further details. We also have an exciting startup competition focusing on medical devices and healthcare robotics. So it's a grand challenge. It has been formed in the way of a grand challenge. Please log into the IHFC website for further details. So now I would request Professor David to launch our newsletter and inaugurate among our audience. Over to you, Professor.
You're on mute, David.
Professor David, you're on mute.
Okay, I opened it up. So you'd like me to go to my slides or?
Shabanu, can you make it easy for us? You may post it on the chat box itself, the link.
Yes.
Okay, let's see. Okay, can you see the slides?
Yeah, okay, fine.
Inauguration.
Yeah, Professor, can you just inaugurate our newsletter to our audience before we can start with the talk?
Oh, okay, that was not clear to me. Let's stop that. So what would you like me to address?
Yeah, you can just click on the link as we mentioned, and so our audience can then read the newsletter, which will be
Okay.
provided on the chat box. Yeah.
Just
So
flip
big
through.
round of applause for our team. Yeah.
Just press on that arrow button at the bottom.
Yeah.
Just once, everybody can just glance through, and later on they can read.
Okay. Nice.
Yeah. Once more. Yes. Once more. Yeah. Once more. Yeah. So now I think we are ready.
Yeah. Now we are ready for the talk. Over to you, Professor.
Okay. How often do you publish these?
Once in every 6 months.
Okay.
So if you have news, please share with us. So it will be ready for next week.
Okay. So first picture of really where we are. It's not a live image. but today it looks very similar to that. So you see in the background a tall building. That's one of our teaching hospitals in Seattle, and next to it is our stadium. So that whole back area is part of the campus here. So I guess with 12 and a half hours difference, you guys are at the end of the day and we are just starting. I'd like to first thank you to inviting me to talk today. It's a very important topic and very near and dear to my heart. It's what I've been working on for the last 25 or so years. I'd like to first do a short introduction of how we think about healthcare simulation. Simulation has been around for quite a while in many different fields. And if we want to go to ancient history, really, we have examples from India, from Egypt, from all kinds of different cultures where simulation has been used for hundreds and hundreds of years to really train people in difficult areas. But we tend to today find a way to use simulation, for example, when the cost of experimentation is too high. So the picture that I show here, it's almost like a historic document. It's when I was still working with industry, and NASA had asked us to work on the physiology of microgravity. And that took quite a while to figure out what the differences are for human physiology between sea level and really what it looks like in microgravity. The results of this effort was that they had to completely change the way they respond to emergencies in space conditions. This picture was taken on, I guess, what was called the vomit comet, trying to do resuscitation on a patient. And as you can see, the only way they could do it is actually by pushing up against the ceiling of the plane to have enough force to do chest compressions. So that's a good example of when simulation becomes interesting. It's also something we like to depend on when the consequences of experimentation are not acceptable. So when you have a human life involved, you don't really want to experiment on a real patient. Or when the task that we're trying to learn has enough complexity that to be ready to perform it, we need to really have multiple trials and attempt different approaches until we know how to best solve a problem. So any one of those justifies to invest in simulation and try to develop the right tool, both to solve problems, but also to train. Why do we really want to have a simulation experience for training in healthcare? So one of the key concepts is that we want the first experience that a provider has with a patient to be safe and actually add to that patient's health. We want to have a way to train different activities in healthcare with a tool that we can use over and over and over. So that goes directly to the cost of training and really reduce our dependence on training on animals, or as medicine has done for many, many years, always training on patients. we want to have a patient analog, if you will, where we can simulate as many different ailments and diseases as we can, so that the learners have plenty of opportunity to really recognize different disease states. There's an interesting paper that was published on that as it relates to general surgery. And in a study, what they found out that as a general surgeon, there is a list of what they call essential procedures that a resident, when they graduate, is allowed to perform. And it's 130 odd different surgeries. And the study showed that by the time residents complete their training, they have experienced no more than the most common 30, and the rest of the list, in most likelihood, they've never encountered during their residency. Yet we expect them to be ready for it. We also keep complaining that we don't have enough mentors for all of our students and our residents. And the right approach to developing a simulator would allow us to have a mentor for each student that can give them feedback while they're learning and practicing, so that they can improve faster and stay on the right track. And finally, given the worldwide shortage, really, of healthcare providers, we want to have better training tools so that every patient can actually have a provider that can help them when they're ill. So, what is simulation? And I'll talk a little bit about the history of how we got where we are today. When we first started out, it really came out of the world of technology. It was mostly people that had experience in flight simulation that got excited about the potential of healthcare simulation. And so, without really knowing healthcare that well, they basically approached it as an interesting technology. In reality, what we're trying to develop is really not technology. It is an educational tool. So as we go through and review some of what has happened and what we need to focus on in the future, we'll keep coming back to this concept. We always have to start by understanding what is the training gap that we're trying to address? What are the learning objectives for the learner? Then we really go through an educational design process to look at what are the different ways by which we can teach and reach those objectives. Of the many models that we have, which one is really best? Then we pick how we want to teach, and just as importantly, we have to decide how we're going to assess the learner's performance. In the educational setting, we always keep repeating that without assessment, there is no learning possible. So we always want to be able to give either proximal feedback or after they've completed the training exercise to let them know how they've done, and more importantly, how can they improve their performance. So that becomes at the very heart of developing a new simulator. It's in support of the teaching method and the assessment method. Once we're done, then we need to validate what we have done and go back and see if that has addressed the training gap. The thing that we need to keep in mind, and there's a lot in the simulation literature trying to validate a simulator, reality is that it is really not possible to validate a simulator. In respect to the science of education, validation is only possible for the assessment instrument. And the question that we are trying to answer when we validate is when we assess a learner's performance, and usually the focus is really on high stakes exams. Is the decision that we make to move that student forward based on the result of the simulation appropriate for what we know about that student and his knowledge and skills in general? One of the challenges, and it's easy to really recognize it in trying to validate a simulator, is that a not so good simulator in the hands of a very good educator that's mentoring a student can accomplish great things. And even the best simulator, if there is no mentor that's guiding the student and telling them what to focus on and how to improve, in the end doesn't really deliver good results. So to kind of wrap this part up, a very important concept, and it took me many years really to recognize this. And I had invited a guest speaker from another university to one of our symposia, and he made the statement. His background is really from cognitive psychology, and it kind of made this light bulb go on. So the purpose of simulation is to elicit the behaviors we want to observe. So the purpose of the simulation is to create the conditions where we can clearly observe if a learner is performing the tasks, making the right decisions that are required based on the learning objectives that we have. And this statement will keep coming back because it's also very important in the development and design phase when we're trying to decide how much fidelity should the simulator have. And we always have to come back to this statement that is the purpose of the simulation is to elicit the behaviors that we want to observe. Is the simulator of high enough fidelity to elicit those behaviors? The simulation itself needs to really cause the student to perform the tasks that we want them to learn. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about really the path that simulation has followed over the last 25, almost 30 years now. Up until now, it's really been very much like a cottage industry. There is no science of healthcare simulation per se. There is computer science, there's mechanical engineering, there's medicine, but we haven't brought those pieces together yet to create really the new science. In many ways, I compare this to when I had started to study computer science. It was almost impossible to find a department of computer science. It's now hard to imagine, but when I first came to the US, and that's what I wanted to study, there were really only 2 or 3 departments of computer science that you could go and get a degree from. Otherwise, you either had to go to mathematics, you could go to physics, or you had to study electrical engineering to get into computer science. And I believe now it's the time that we start to formulate the science of healthcare simulation. And the picture here, and it shows you the challenge. is from one of the larger projects that we had done. And all the people that you see here were our collaborators and participants. And every one of them came from a different field. There were at one end program managers, a group of clinicians on the other end, and in between computer science people, arts people that knew how to do modeling. We had digital artists that came from the gaming industry. We had embedded software people. We had hardware developers, mechanical engineers. And when you form a team to develop a new simulator, you really need all of them to be able to work together, to collaborate, and they have to have a common language. And that common language will only come together as we move really this field forward to formalize it as a science. So a few older pictures. This is a simulator that was basically homegrown circa 1995. It was basically a technology demonstration. Our belief was build it and they will come. It really didn't have any educational content. We could do assessment with it. But we were so excited that we finally had a way to simulate a surgical experience we thought everybody would want it. Of course, didn't happen. Second generation, and one of the examples here is the MIST VR that came out of England. So 1997 to 2002, it was quite popular. And with that one, we said, okay, really, clinicians are not going to buy into simulation until we validate and show that skills learned on the simulator transfer to the OR and the real environment. So the gentleman that you see in that picture, he's from Ireland, published some of the early papers on this topic. And yep, it was demonstrated that if you practice on a simulator, some of the skills transfer to the real environment. And so back then our belief was once we validate the simulator, well, everybody will want one. And the promise was objective assessment, that the simulator doesn't lie. It will tell us if somebody knows what they're doing or not. Didn't happen. You know, of course, there were some simulators sold and many institutions got their first few and started to play with it, but it really didn't take off the way we always believed it would. So then came a third generation, really in our process, and the focus was on let's develop a curriculum around the simulators. What are we going to teach with it? How are we going to assess it? And once we put all these pieces together, and the concept was that you had to pass certain things on the simulator before you will allowed to do it in the real world. And some institutions actually did that, yet it didn't really take off still. I mean, but the important thing from the science perspective to keep in mind with that is when you look at what happened in 1995 and 1997, whenever I used to go online and do a search on medical simulation, surgical simulation, we would find at best 5 to 10 articles per year. By the time we're looking at fourth generation in 2005, and we thought we had a new approach, we probably could find 100 to 150 articles per year. And today, when we search for medical simulation, we really have to set our filters quite fine. Otherwise, there are way too many articles all talking about different aspects of healthcare simulation. And so by 2005, we said, okay, if we really want to entice people to get into simulation, we need to have families of product. You can build additional variations, and if you buy into a system, then it'll be easier to kind of grow the field and have people acquire more simulators. And by that time, we were starting to engage educators to help us with the design process. By 2005, we were also starting to look at, okay, if you want to build a good simulator, you need to teach not only technical skills, but address knowledge and judgment, so decision making, that we needed to look at team-based training and really have a way to model physiology and then disease states. So during all those years, I was really working on the industry side, and they always wanted to know, so when are we going to sell enough simulators to make this worthwhile? And really starting in the late 90s, when I looked at the value of simulation and what it could bring, I could see no reason why people wouldn't want it. So it was always, next year will be it, and we'll be ready to go with it. In 2011, I finally started guessing. In many ways, when I first started with healthcare simulation, I would go and present the concept to thought leaders, to well-known surgeons. They pretty much would throw me out of the room. The belief was medicine is way too serious. You can't practice on machines. We'll always learn on patients. That is tried and true. Don't bother us with all of this. Today, simulation is a training and training tool in medicine, and healthcare is absolutely accepted. It's more a matter of how advanced the skill can you teach? How do we bring the costs down? How do we make it broadly available, et cetera? So it's a very different environment than when I first started. So here's a quick clip from a project we completed about 1.5 years ago. So this is very different from where we started. It is not a virtual reality simulator. This is a physical trainer with the organs replicated in different materials, mostly variations on silicone. And the reason why we took this turn away from VR, because when we first started out, we worked strictly with VR. That was the big promise. We never could get virtual simulators to replicate the feel, the haptic interaction, and really the look of tool tissue interaction. So we decided to take what was exciting with VR simulation and apply it to physical simulation. So what we wanted to be able to do is assess performance, which meant that we had to build physical simulators that are sensorized so that we're getting real data back from them. So here are some of the models that we had to create for this project. You see all these organs. On the right-hand side, you see liver, spleen, pancreas. You have fatty tissue. You have some of the major blood vessels in here. They are all plumbed, so they can bleed. We can, for some parts, sense when you touch it, when you apply pressure to it. and all that information is then fed back to a computer. What is important is that everything that we do within our lab at the Center for Research and Education in Simulation Technologies here in Washington is that we start with MRI data of a sampled patient, and we need to decide what the proper demographic is. So we pick a patient, take the MRI data, segment into 3D models, and then from those models we print molds into which we can cast the silicone parts, so that when we simulate a patient and we build a full body, every aspect of it is correct as far as the selected patient is concerned. Another aspect, and that is very important too, and it doesn't matter if it's virtual or physical or augmented reality. For the clinicians, a very important piece of information comes from the interaction between their hands and tissue or the instruments and tissue. And for all these years in VR, it has been a great challenge to make sure that the physics of that interaction are modeled correctly. So we started an effort, and it's now been going on for almost 10 years, where we've been collecting tissue properties from cadaveric organs, but typically patients that have donated their body to science, and it has to be within 24 to 48 hours after death to get good data. And we've been building a database around that. So what has helped us get there? Interestingly, most of the funding has come from the military, so it's from the government. There's been a push to move work towards open source, to encourage collaboration between many different groups within industry, academia, and the government. And then for us that started in this field and now are trying to turn it into a science, it's been really a matter of passion. Because the promise had a long time to really arrive, and we're still building towards that. But we want to move from this pure passion to turn it into science. So I believe that open source efforts are very important. I want to quickly touch upon a couple others from what we have done. You probably are familiar with this effort. This one started in the US at MIT, then the postdocs that worked on it, when they finished their work, they took the project back with them to France. So SOFA is a VR simulation platform that's open source, physics-based. It is quite capable by now, and it has a pretty good following and a community that builds on top of it. They have annual meetings, they have a technical steering committee. So it's something, if you haven't looked at, you definitely should consider. Then another project that was funded again by the Department of Defense. It is an open source physiology engine that's available to all. And the physiology engine is critical to any healthcare simulation effort. Is it perfect? No, it takes a lot of time and effort. But what is important is that it's open source. So based on what you're simulating, you have the option to get in and improve the parts that are critical to your efforts. And then our university was involved in the Modular Healthcare Simulation and Education System, or MOSES. It started out as the Advanced Modular Mannequin. And that is available as an open source platform, and all the data that's been generated has been published online. And I can provide you the links to all of these. So between those three, there is enough to really start pretty sophisticated platform development efforts for healthcare simulation. So I'll talk a little bit about the Moses software. It's interesting. It started out as a mannequin development platform. It really turned into an architecture effort. But what is important with it is that it's modular, interoperable, and distributed. Different groups, different companies can create new modules, and as long as they follow the standards and connect to the data bus, they can become part of this ecosystem. And what is critical with this architecture is that no module developer has to expose their intellectual property to any of the other modules. As long as they follow the standards, they all can communicate and collaborate. Quick picture here, it starts to show what already has been done. Each one of these boxes represents another module. Some developed at the university, some by small companies, some by large companies. And we demonstrated many times how easy it is to take all of these, integrate them through this platform, then have them work together. So here's a quick operational example. We have a module that is an IV arm. It has a sensor in a vein that if you start an IV and start to push fluids, it can actually measure that flow and report it back to the physiology engine. It also has the ability to recognize pain and communicate that, so that a virtual patient could actually show an expression of pain or voice it. As you start to introduce fluids to the patient, it changes the physiology. That is communicated across the data bus to another module that's actually tablet-based, that is a patient monitor. And in between, you have the physiology engine that's really reading all the inputs, providing the new outputs, and providing data on the state of the patient. So it's almost like building a Lego model of healthcare simulation. And at this stage of the game, I can see that at least for the next 10 years, we can keep building new modules and capabilities and added to this. And it's a path to accelerate development. One of our collaborators made that statement that it's like crowdsourcing simulation module development, because the need to create new modules is so big that no single company or research institution or really the many small companies that are out there today have the bandwidth to develop everything that is needed. So it needs to be a collaborative process. What really supports all of this is that we start to focus on standards, and the standards include data models, which is, hey, we need to speak a common language so that all modules can communicate. A common scenario file, which is the input to simulation, so that once a scenario is written, you can really run it on any simulator. And then we need to standardize the way you look at learner performance, so we can compare the results of training on one simulator versus the other in a realistic way. So where we sit today and we are looking at doing research, there are really known unknowns. We really don't know what fidelity means. We keep asking for more fidelity, less fidelity. Is fidelity driving by cost? We haven't really turned the notion of fidelity into something that science can deal with it. As I work between clinicians and the engineers always want inputs that are quantifiable, measurable, and repeatable. And until we get to a point where we can decide what are the components of fidelity and how much of each one is needed to achieve the learning objectives, the engineers really will keep shaking their head and tell us the same thing. I really don't know how to address your request for fidelity. Proving the training effect is still an open area. We've done quite a bit, but that is still an area of research. How can we show that training on the simulator translates truly into better patient outcomes? Performance assessment is part of that. Validation is part of it. So really the bigger questions are both in defining the requirements and the educational research side. On the other side, we have some unknown unknowns. As we really look at it from a science perspective and we try to look well ahead of today, what to work on, we really don't know what medicine is going to look like 25, 50 years from now. Surgery might very well become a thing of the past. The way we treat diseases or prevent diseases might require a very different set of skills than what we know and understand today. So the important question for us as simulationists is, how are we going to prepare or retrain the caregivers for the future of medicine if we don't know what medicine will look like? So in one way, the easier method to look at it is who's working on the future of medicine. So in academic medicine, you can start to get some hints. But how do we really prepare for it? How do we look ahead? What should we look at in research? And in many ways, there's a simple answer. The one thing that we don't expect to change in the next 25 to 50 years is the human body. And for medical simulation to really perform correctly and give us the results that we're interested in, the better we can mimic, the better we can replicate the human body, the better our simulators will become, regardless of the treatment modality that will be current 10 years out, 15 years out. So the focus needs to be on the human body. What are the things that we don't do too well today? Skin is a very important component, and there's so much a clinician can tell by just interacting with the skin of the patient. So changes in color, changes in touch when you compress it, looking at wounds and how they progress, infection, all the childhood diseases. These are all things that the human skin displays. We don't quite know how to do that so far. So that's a big area of research that, is starting to get funded. Clearly, we need to keep improving physiology engines because at the end, a lot of what happens to the human body is driven and governed by physiology. So the more accurate our physiology engines become, the better simulator we can build. At the end, what we're really trying to do is figure out how can we best display the state of the patient so that the caregiver can assess the state of the patient and make an informed decision on how to treat the patient. So one of the things we are doing on our end, and I hope that we'll have opportunities to collaborate. Our lab has been in existence now for almost 15 years. We started out at the University of Minnesota before we just moved the whole team here to Seattle to continue our work. We finally decided that it was time to turn this into science. And so we started out a new division. We are housed within the Department of Surgery to start to teach, I guess, what we have learned by experience over the last 15, 20 years to students that come from a background in art, computer science, medicine, mechanical engineering, computer science. How do we teach them to become simulationists and at the end have a common language so they can continue to do research, but also to train people that can go back out into industry and be a good resource for simulation companies? So as I look at where we are in many ways as you're starting this new effort, how do you best jumpstart a program? So we need to play to our strengths. So we look at our own faculty. Who is teaching? What is their backgrounds? What are we missing? How do we recruit the right faculty members? Then we look at our student population. As we recruit students and start to train them, what kind of backgrounds do they have? Where are the strengths of our own university? And how do we build on top of that? And then finally, we look to the industry that surrounds us and we look at what are they interested in? What kind of resources can we develop within the university that will meet the industry's needs? And it needs to be value added, because when you first start a new program, certainly you get some philanthropy, you might get some help from the government, military, etc. But eventually you have to be able to stand on your own 2 feet. And so, we have to build upon this, upon what we have to make the program stronger and more interesting. We need to build a set of local competencies so that industry can is interested in working with us. And most importantly, with this whole push for open source development, instead of starting from scratch, we need to look at everything that's already been done and is available and kind of build on top of it. And so with open source, we can look at crowdsourcing, which I mentioned before. It really helps with collaboration. And with most of the platforms we've looked at, individual IP is protected, but yet all these modules can work together. And we need to support standards to really help with collaboration and crowdsourcing. So with that, and I'll let this video clip run, part of our contribution to open source is we actually have selected a male and a female patient, did full body MRIs, live casts, and optical scans, segmented the data, and everything that you see in this video clip, we've pushed onto our website, and it's available to download, no cost, and it's just an example of how to get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for a really interesting talk. So now we can take up the questions from our audience, and I would request to raise your everyone to raise your hand and we can sequentially call and take up the question. Yes. Yeah, so Professor Sritikanto Roy, please go ahead.
Oh, hi. Thanks for an excellent talk. So I just wanted to know that, okay, you talked about VR-based simulation and also you talked about physical simulation. So can you just briefly tell that what are the missing blocks till now in the physical simulation domain and the VR simulation thing, and why do you think that the physical simulation probably would be the uh, better bridge between the simulation world and actual medical practitioners? So
Certainly. So I don't think that one is better than the other. It's just a matter of where are we currently in solving the technical problems. So for certain type of training, VR is still a very meaningful answer. So if we look at developing for surgeons basic skills, hand-to-eye coordinations, having control of your instruments, those we can largely teach on a VR platform today. They're good enough. But as soon as you start to talk about complex procedures and the difficult maneuvers that surgeons have to learn, haptics becomes so important that no matter how hard we've tried, anything that we've done with virtual haptics, and it's been around for quite a while, it's not real to the surgeons. And so it's really one of these interesting challenges. If you're an expert and you work with a VR simulator, because of the way most of them are designed, it will kind of let you do all the right things, and therefore you believe it's a good simulator. If you're a novice, if you happen to touch the right structures, again, things almost automatically happen. And so you believe that you're learning something, but you're not. So really that wall that we hit on the VR side, and for the first 6-7 years, all what we did was VR development. We kind of walked away from it and we said, okay, until haptics becomes much more realistic, we'll go back to physical models where we can create structures that when you interact with them, they actually feel correctly, so that they look correctly. So deformations, when an instrument interacts with tissue and when you grasp it, as you pull it, there is so much that happens that VR is not capable of supplying. So we've gone to the physical side. I don't know that long term that's going to be the best approach, but it is one way of doing it. And obviously today there's a lot of hybrid approaches. So augmented reality, overlaying data onto physical objects. I don't know which one will be the right answer long term, but we need to keep pushing on all of them.
and what is the just last question? What is the missing block in the physical simulation domain? Is it the when you talk about the realism? So how do you I mean, like tissue properties, the physics of the tissues, and those are the real.
Yep.
So are those the building blocks? And
So there are a couple of things that need to happen. One is obviously tissue properties. The other one is the fidelity of our sensors. So we're looking for things like blood flow, blood loss, pressure, location, and we can use pretty expensive sensors and get good data. They're not perfect, so we need to work on make them smaller and cheaper. Tissue properties is where we've done a ton of work. So we have currently a project that is funded by the government where we are 3D printing tissue samples that have behaviors, so anisotropic materials. So they're 3D printed to behave differently if you pull them in one direction versus the other. And that is progressing quite nicely. We've come up with some good answers, and it's a collaboration between our current institution and our old institution, so between the University of Minnesota and the University of Washington. We're getting pretty close to what we need there. So the most difficult thing to teach in surgery is really the notion of dissection, blunt, sharp, with energy, so using cautery or lasers. And so the tissues that we create really need to respond to all of these modalities in a proper way so we can teach these critical steps. So on one side, it is just getting tissues better and better, and we have a lot of data on that side. The other one is really finding sensors. And in a way, it's really great that you're doing this collaboration with industry too, because when I look at the resources there that are available here, so we are in Seattle, so obviously Microsoft has their headquarters here, Amazon has their headquarters here, tremendous amount of research that goes on. Apple just built a big facility here. We would love to use their technology, but they're really not that accessible. When I look at something like the iPhone, the amount of miniaturized processors and sensors that are embedded in it that we could actually use in a simulator, it'd be great. But, when you approach them and say, hey, could we get some of these sensors that you used for maybe tracking or, it's not that easy. And so we need to get to a point where we have access to really very advanced sensors so we can track what the learner is doing with the models. And at the end, what really matters, talking about sensors, it's really not what you do, but based on what you do, how is the patient doing? In medical training, the only thing that really matters in assessment, whatever you did, is the patient getting better or worse? If the patient is getting better, you're doing the right things, because then you're looking at decision making. Every step of the way, is every step that you take, is it helping the patient or not? So that really defines how we look at the world of sensors. We need to know where you're doing it. We need to know how much you're doing it. And then we look at the feedback coming back from the physiology engine to see if the patient is getting better or worse. I hope that helps.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Anirban?
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Professor, for such a nice talk. I'm just curious about one thing, that through simulation, is it possible to study the diseases, like finding out a cause of a disease or suppose a cardiovascular incident like stroke and all? So is it possible to study a disease and progression of a disease in that way? Thank you.
The promise is there. We aren't quite advanced enough to do that, but there are several grants that we applied to where that is what's being asked. So again, at least in the US, it's the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Defense that are funding. So it's really the notion of in silico clinical trials. Can we take large numbers of drug candidates and test them against physiologic models and see how the body will respond to it? So there's a lot of work going on in that area. It's been going on now for maybe 10, 12 years. It's getting closer and closer. But that is one of the promises of this field, and that has nothing to do with either physical or virtual simulation. It's all about the physiology engine itself. Have we developed good enough mathematical models of how our organs function to properly respond to different drugs? And it's a bit different from what we use in surgical simulation, because we look at the behavior of organs. There's a whole other department within the university, it's still part of the School of Medicine, that looks at physiologic modeling at the cellular level. And that's really what is needed to look at disease states and progression and, how they react to different treatments. We've done some work because it's so important to delivery of healthcare, addressing sepsis, and see how well we can model that, because that is a very fast moving cascade of events, and training for it is a big challenge, as you can't really let residents practice on septic patients. You need to always do the right things. So we've spent quite a bit of time looking at creating good models for sepsis. So yes, that's another area of simulation, and it's very important.
Yeah, Mr. Anirban, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you, Professor, for your answer. Thank you.
Yeah, so finally, Dr. Gagan Deep Meena. Yeah, the last question.
Yeah, thanks thank you, Professor, for the talk, and it was interesting. And somewhere you mentioned that about the challenges in the future medicine, and you mentioned that there will be changes in the body as well. If we talk about down the line, like 30 years or 50 years. So, yeah, what sort of changes you are indicating to? Yeah.
Right. So I guess maybe I didn't state it clearly enough. What I was trying to say is that there are going to be considerable changes in how we provide healthcare. So medical science will change. The one thing that will not change is the human body. So as we look at research for the next 10, 15, 20 years, what we know will always be valuable is to better understand the way the human body works in response to things, to improve the quality of our models, regardless of how we'll be treating the body in the future. So I'm sorry if that didn't come across correctly. I didn't mean that the human body will change. That goes beyond
exactly. I mean,
our scope of simulation.
I don't. Yeah, I mean, I thought maybe you are indicating to the practices which might, make several clinical or medical science-based changes in the human body, which can. I thought maybe in that area you are indicating. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I attended a very interesting conference quite a number of years ago. It was a small group in Boston. It was a medical conference where they had no clinicians. It was quite interesting. And a lot of very well-known futurists were there, quite a number of Nobel laureates that presented. And the consensus was that in the next 25 years, humans will manage to create a new life form. And they accepted that as a given. They just didn't know if it would be biologic or digital in nature. So I'm pretty sure there are researchers that work on, how can we improve on the human body and change it over time, but that is not really our focus. We're accepting the human body as it is today and see how closely we can model it.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gagandeep. So now I would request Professor Saha to provide the final remarks. And Professor Saha, are you there?
Yeah. So thanks, David. Finally you could make it after some time. And thanks for your time and inaugurating our newsletter. For your information, as we have discussed in our first meeting, we are going ahead very aggressively to set up our that simulation center, and we certainly be happy to collaborate with you. And we are also planning an MTech Master of Technology program on robotics, where medical robotics and surgical and small section will be also added up. It may take about a year and a half to materialize. So I think let us be in touch, and thank you for coming and enlightening us in these directions. Thank you.
No, thank you for having me. And if anybody wants to have my email to communicate, that's perfectly fine. And I'm hoping that we will find some way to collaborate on projects going forward.
Yes.
There's really so much work to do. It's scary. So we need to collaborate.
Yes, certainly. And that online that link you have provided, it was really helpful. It was some education to me. Now let's see how we can use it. Actually, that's our future.
Sure. We're going to use the platform for student projects here anyway. So we're working towards creating better documentation and really low cost implementations to start to experiment with.
Yes.
I did one project with bioengineering students, and we were able to put the whole platform on a set of Raspberry Pi boards. So it was like $190 of hardware, and we were able to run both the mannequin software and the physiology engine on just that one board. So it's a good way to get going.
Yeah. So let us be in touch, and thanks my team, Udayan and the team, and the audience, staying so live in the chat till almost like 8:45 in the night. So David, see you very soon, hopefully.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye. Thank you.